All right. We're live. Thank you for joining us, everyone. This is Utah Stories. I'm Richard Marcosian. So a couple of weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, I attended the gubernatorial debate, and it was quite interesting. And one of the terms that was brought up was that Utah is in a golden age, that more money is pouring into Utah than ever before. More people are coming in. Everything's wonderful. Everybody's just rich, except the middle class and most people living in Utah. We're feeling the pinch of housing. We're feeling the pinch of inflation. And we're not in a golden age if you don't make $150,000 a year. So with me on the show today, I have a very exciting guest. It is Rob Latham. He is running for governor as the Libertarian candidate. Thank you so much for joining me, Rob.
Great to be with you, Richard. Thanks for having me.
So what is your answer? Are we living in a golden age in Utah? If so, why? If not, why?
Well, the answer I gave, we had this media scrum. I would encourage people to go back and look. I was asked that question after that debate. And some people may recall an author by the name of Steven Pinker. He wrote this book called Enlightenment Now. And his point was that if you had to choose any time in history to be born, you would always choose to be born now because, you know, our world is advancing and things just, you know, technology, quality of life. Yes, we have problems in the world, but generally speaking, things are getting better over time. And even the incumbent said he can't necessarily take credit for what Utah is experiencing now just because things continue to progress. And so might we be living in a golden age? Well, I'd argue just, you know, when you talk about the red teams and the blue teams, Libertarians are the gold team. So we would love to have a true golden age. That's a liberating age. And we think that can happen through policies that are less extractive, less repressive, less intrusive, less abusive. And you only get that by putting libertarians in control of that, you know, government infrastructure rather than the folks who are there now, who are seeming to use that infrastructure to benefit themselves, not necessarily the people they are charged with, you know, protecting.
And I totally agree with you there because I've been sharing with some listeners on this podcast that I've read a book called The Myth of Capitalism. Mm-hmm. And the whole capitalist ideals are antitrust and not allowing oligopolies and monopolies to dominate each given industry and sector in our economy. We actually do not have that at all. There are 4 or 5 players that dominate nearly every major industry in the United States, from pharmaceuticals to the military, to our food and agriculture, to the airline industry, to the energy industries. And we've been allowing all these mergers to occur so that these giant corporations have attained what's called regulatory capture. Right. In that they write the policies that they have to adhere to. Mm-hmm. They own the policy makers who are supposed to protect us from monopolies. Right. And they're in the back pockets of these policymakers. And that's because our government is so giant and so intrusive. Mm-hmm. And so what would you do as governor to fix all that?
Well, you talked about corporations. So maybe my running mate, who Barry Short, who's with us, could talk a little bit about that plan, because that's, I think, dealing with corporations, which they just don't happen naturally. Something like a co-op where people get together and combine resources is maybe a more natural way of organizing to solve a problem. Corporations have this additional thing that the rest of us don't have when we get together to solve a problem, and that's that corporate shield from liability. And that the state can only give that kind of privilege, right? So one of the solutions might be, in exchange for that privilege, having further oversight or removing that privilege. So that might be one solution there. But getting back to this idea of concentration, I would say most libertarian economists think that you don't get that kind of concentration without government intervention, and that it is these privileges that allow those combinations to happen. And then if you let the market just play out, you would see more decentralization. You would see less privilege. A very esoteric issue is intellectual property, and maybe we don't have to get into that in this, because but there are some libertarians who say we need to get rid of that, like patents, because that protects, again, privilege, and it's anti-consumer. It allows someone who may want to make a innovation on some existing product that's patent protected. They can't do that without the permission of the patent holder. So getting rid of those state-sponsored privileges is one solution. In the Libertarian Party right now, we're actually kind of starting to move something called Project Decentralized Revolution. The idea is that we want to, move these problems out of concentrations and have solutions that are more localized, more decentralized. And by, we're disrupting these concentrations of power and privilege that didn't just happen by accident. They happened by, as you say, regulatory capture of the government, and then using that for crony capitalism, giving state-sponsored benefits.
And that's kind of what we've been preaching in Utah Stories for years, is decentralization of economic power. Because if all we do is shop at the Walmarts and the Costco's and all the fast food restaurants, we're basically just giving all of our voting power for what we want in our economy over to Wall Street. We're telling Wall Street, hey, we love you, more of that. And people kind of don't realize you're voting with your dollars. So if you like local business and you want decentralized economies and a local vitality, you need to vote for those locally owned businesses, the smaller shops, the smaller players, because what does any giant corporation do in the interests of their shareholders, like Walmart? They start buying off politicians, they start writing the laws, they start capturing the regulation agencies that might inhibit competitors. And so I think that's a very important key. I got to show this clip. This is on this is in your campaign video. Okay. It's quite an interesting video. We're gonna change gears and talk about this. This is Governor Cox being, it seems like he was asked rather gently, what is your policy on smart cities, by a man by the name of Jason Preston, who I actually met years ago on January 2nd at the state capitol. But I'm going to play this clip for you now, and you tell me about it.
Tell me your thoughts on the smart cities. What smart cities? Smart cities. Smart cities. No. Sure. I don't know what you're talking about.
Listeners can hear it.
So stop making up stuff.
I'll tell you what he's saying. He's saying, what are smart cities? And Governor Cox says there's no such thing as smart cities. They don't exist. And why you're coming up here and you keep asking me. And obviously, he believes he's using the whole smart city term to smear Governor Cox. Okay. Well, we'll stop it right there. So, so obviously Governor Cox didn't like that. You put this in part of your campaign video is in relation to political bullying.
Right.
So first of all, did you do that in relation to smart cities, or did you do it in relation to how political leaders bully people who ask too many questions?
I was focusing on the bullying aspect, and if people go and see the ad it's on my social media, YouTube, Instagram, whatever. It actually starts with a clip of Representative Brian King, who is the Democratic candidate for governor, right? So there was a clip of him, bodying up to, I believe it was State Senator Daniel Thatcher. They were having some kind of dispute about something, and so you saw a little shoving match take place there in the Capitol. And so I thought, we have that clip, and then I was aware of this other clip for the incumbent governor, and then I became aware of yet another clip, which I added to that ad as well. And again, just to show that there is this kind of bullying mentality between the incumbent political parties, and I want to, offer myself as an antidote to that. That libertarians, reject using aggression to kind of get your way in the world. We would, rather rely on, peaceful persuasion to kind of have people kind of move in what we believe is, a mutually beneficial direction. Mm-hmm. So, so that would we think there's some symbology. What's the word I'm looking for here? Symbolism. Yeah. in those two video clips, and contrasting that with our more liberty-minded approach, and obviously just being real about things. I'm just one person. I'm not running for king. I can't snap my fingers and wave a magic wand. We're the people of Utah to put me to work. I'd have to work with the existing legislature. There may change a couple of seats in this cycle, but it might be largely the same.
Well, you also have this very stark divide mm-hmm. in Utah and every other state in our entire country right now, mm-hmm. Between the media and information you get from the left and the media and information that you get from the right. Mm-hmm. You could conclude we live on two different planets mm-hmm. because it's just like we're not being delivered. The information's not being delivered in a way that is conducive to free and fair debate. And it's like, I think the parties just talk right past each other. Mm-hmm. And we've covered this book banning controversy in Utah.
Yes.
And it's like, they're just not even discussing it. They're just saying, oh, you're trying to groom kids using books. Mm-hmm. And then they'll say, no, we're not. We're just trying to introduce kids to literature. You're allowing porn in books. We're going to ban all the books that have porn in it. And you can't, porn isn't classified in literature. You can't read, porn really. But it's just this crazy, and tit for tat now. Like they're banning that, and then they're going to put tampons in the men's room, and it's just crazy. This whole political environment. So you believe having a third party with a stronger voice, with a stronger presence, that would mitigate all these impacts we're seeing.
Well, hopefully we'd offer a balance. And when you look at the numbers in Utah on voter registration, for example, so there's roughly 500,000 unaffiliated and independent voters in Utah, and that compares, I think, to the maybe roughly 2 million that are registered in total. And so, yeah, there's a big chunk that are Democrat. Yeah, there's a big chunk that are Republican, almost twice as much. But the Republican Party itself right now is almost split right down the middle. You have almost a civil war going on between the incumbent and then the guy who's now mounting a write-in campaign against him, right? So, looking at the math, we're thinking, gosh, we may only need in the high 20s to win this election. And, I was polling at just under 7% to qualify for that debate with a margin of error. That takes you all the way up to maybe 11%. And I told the story of Jesse Ventura when he ran for governor of Minnesota in 1998. He was in the teens when he started in the debate and got elected. He was in the three-way race, though, with the high 30s. So, recall this poll, the Gallup organization does this poll every year. And last year, I don't think I've seen the one for this year, the highest number they ever received, I want to say it was 63% of Americans want some alternative to the incumbent two parties. That's a huge number. It's the highest it's ever been. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of people are looking for an alternative to the incumbent political parties. And yet, just sometimes wherever I go, I'm the first libertarian anybody's ever met, right? Just because we talked about the media organizations and who, we have one that kind of caters to the Republicans, right? We have one that kind of caters to the Democrats. And it doesn't seem like there's anyone catering to the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And so, so sometimes it's a struggle to get those channels of communication out there to do that. But we are seeing in this election cycle, maybe kind of a breakthrough moment. I'm the first third party candidate to qualify for a statewide debate. Our attorney general candidate qualified. Actually, 2 attorney general candidates qualified for third party. Yeah, so it'll be a 4-way debate next week. That'll be a fun one to watch. And then our candidate for Congress in the 1st Congressional District qualified. So we're seeing that opportunity
it's
now.
a real libertarian moment.
It's a real libertarian moment in Utah right now. And so, you know, my campaign is about growing the liberty vote. And this is one way we do that, is by putting ourselves out there, giving voters that opportunity, and getting our message so we can connect. And we may not prevail in this election cycle, I mean, being realistic, but we've got at least progress to build upon for the future.
And you don't see yourself in sort of a spoiler role for either candidate necessarily? Is the Libertarians more Democrat or Republican, or does it feel like you get equally? I mean, if you're going to take votes from one candidate or another, is that possible?
Well, I think most libertarians reject the we're taking votes from anybody. I mean, we're kind of our own unique thing. I mean, there's a saying, you can't spoil what's already rotten. So I don't think we're spoiling anything on that front. But then there are polls that show that, you know, some people say if the Libertarian candidate was not in the race, we just wouldn't vote. So there's that dynamic. There's this thing called the Nolan chart. I don't know if people have seen it. It's a diamond chart just to show people that there's a difference between left and right. There might be an up and a down. I'd encourage people to go online. It's Advocates for Self-Government. It's a 10 quiz question. Maybe it'd be fun for you to take it online even. It'd be kind of fun. During one of your shows, this show or another show. And then it shows, you know, where am I on the map? Am I left? Am I right? Am I up? Am I down? Am I in the center? You know, like kind of populist kind of thing. And so some polling organizations have administered that chart to folks. And they say roughly about 15 to 20% of the population is ideologically libertarian. Now, only about 4 to 5% identify as libertarian. I didn't connect that until I was in law school and kind of came across libertarian literature. And I said, oh, I guess that's what
was it that got it for you? What made you decide to be libertarian, or find out you are a libertarian?
Well, that's a long, I mean, the law school version is, there's this guy named Richard Epstein. He's a law professor and he writes a property textbook. And so I looked into him more, and he described himself as a libertarian. I relate in an op-ed that I talked about about ending benevolent terror in Utah. So I'm growing up here in Olympus Cove, and I was 8 years old, and the whole John Singer episode up in Summit County took place. Maybe this is before your time. This was a family that had immigrated from Germany, and so they kind of old world sensibilities, and they didn't like their kids, what they were being taught in the government schools. Mm-hmm. So they pulled their kids out of the schools. This was back the time where you couldn't really do that. You could not opt out. And so they got into it with the school district, got into it with the local authorities. Anyway, there was a confrontation at their ranch, and a sheriff's deputy shot John Singer dead. And I remember my father just being very distressed, and other adults and families in my community just being very distressed over that state doing something so drastic. And like, what role do we have in terms of raising our kids when the state can come and do this to us? So I think that was kind of just my awareness of that gravitated over time, you know, being here at Olympus High School in senior debate. We had agricultural policy, and my partner and I chose cannabis legalization of all topics, not soil erosion, not bioregions, but that seemed interesting. And we came to learn that, okay, just something might be considered a social ill, maybe making it illegal is not the best way to deal with that. And now I don't think we can even call it a social ill, given what we know about medical cannabis and all its healing properties. So, so that was kind of just my entree into that libertarian way of thinking. And so, you know, and it's just kind of grown since then.
I call myself a liberal libertarian.
Okay.
Because I cannot, after talking to so many people in the city, mm-hmm. I can identify why so many are liberal. They mm-hmm. want the government to solve, you know, terrible air quality mm-hmm. and traffic and congestion, and mm-hmm. they want the government to preserve open space, and they want the government to have parks and do this and that. So mm-hmm. I can understand why most people in the city are liberals, mm-hmm. but you go out of the city and you don't want the government doing anything. Just mm-hmm. like, stay out of my life. Mm-hmm. You want to be allowed to create your own wealth and open up a business or a shop or produce a product. Mm-hmm. You don't need these regulatory agencies breathing down your neck because you want to make smoked sausage in your backyard.
Right.
And So I think that what I see the problem being is we are trying to apply this one size fits all solution.
Mm-hmm.
You're either Republican or Democrat,
Mm-hmm.
whether you live in the city or the country,
Right.
and that just doesn't work anymore because everybody who lives in a country area
Mm-hmm.
wants the government off their back, and everybody in the city wants more government. And
Mm-hmm.
and so you see this rural city divide, which
Mm-hmm.
is the real divide in our country.
Mm-hmm.
And I do not believe either party provides any kind of real solution so that the two parties can get along anymore.
Right. And they're looking at their old models of solving problems. You know, I was talking to students at Southern Utah University earlier this week, and someone was asking me, are libertarians anti-government? And my answer is no, because I think, you know, our issue is monopoly government, meaning a government that claims a monopoly over adjudicating disputes. But what about competing governments or designer governments, or, you know, my government is an app on my phone that I can subscribe to and solve problems?
Well, many would argue Facebook and Google are now governments because they regulate free speech.
Maybe.
And to appeal to the great Google
Mm-hmm.
God to
Right.
actually say on Google in an article what you want to say is now a thing. You
Mm-hmm.
have to make appeals if they say your content is misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like this whole big brother emergence by that tech monopoly. How, as a libertarian, do you handle that?
Well, and I follow a lot of that as well. We've seen this instances of jawboning, right? So the federal government has actually been applying pressure to these social media companies. So maybe it wasn't necessarily organic or driven by these social media companies. It was Big Brother government coming down and saying, "Hey, you better, you know, restrict speech in this way." So maybe it was, you know, not a pure market response to, you know, problems on their network.
I think it was advertised, like Big Pharma telling YouTube, do not let your creators say the word COVID. Luckily, that's passed, but I just see, you know, these tech companies and these oligopolies that control these different markets really dictating where government policy goes. You say that there should be competing governments. I guess elaborate on that a little bit further.
Well, so there's this German economist, Bruno Frey, and he has kind of articulated this concept, FOCJs, functionally overlapping competing jurisdictions. And when you think about like your water district in your neighborhood, and then there's maybe a sewer district, and there's maybe a mosquito abatement district, and there's a school district. And so they may overlay one another, but they're not necessarily geographically contiguous. And so that the idea is like, wait a second, these are all different districts. They're governing different things. Why can't I, as a person living in this neighborhood, subscribe to just one entity that can solve these problems for me? And you may run into a problem like the speed limit on your road. Who decides that? Well, maybe it's the developer of your proprietary community or your intentional community that decides how to do that, how to police that. What kind of fees everybody who lives in that community pays to keep that up.
So I'm not sure I understand. So you have all these districts, right, layered on top of each other.
Right. That's the default it is now. I'm not saying that's the libertarian utopia. By the way, libertarians reject the idea that there's, any kind of utopia, right? We're all, flawed human beings, so we're going to have problems. Mm-hmm. But the idea is that you can decentralize these monopoly special service districts and slice those up into something that then consumers of those services can make a choice. And they can exit, right? Like you can exit Google, you can exit Facebook. I guess I don't want to plug one. A lot of the libertarian have been saying Nostr is the next big, social media one that won't be controlled or job-owned by government. So I haven't looked into it deeply. I think I created an account just to get my...
But your point is like you could opt out of those services then?
Right.
Like you could opt out of the sewer district that you're in, or...
Well, you could, although I suppose if you were living in a place where you're connected, that would be kind of difficult. But there's an interesting article I was reading in these about... we're talking about tiny homes, and in the debate I talked about the Free to Build project, which might be one way to solve the housing issue in Utah. We're running into these municipalities who have minimum lot sizes and minimum setback requirements that make it illegal to create these cottage court communities, right? So that project, I think, holds a lot of promise if we want to increase housing availability. But the point of that is, so I was the town attorney for Big Water, Utah, if you know where that is, just north of Lake Powell, for a brief period of time, for about 6 months. There was a libertarian mayor down there, and he wanted a liberty-minded prosecutor. My first day on the job, by the way, I dismissed about 24 cases because there was no victim attached to them. But they were all on septic down there, is the long way of getting to that point I was. So they didn't have a sewer system. And you can actually go online and talk about the cost of sewer versus septic. And apparently septic competes quite well against sewer. You don't have that built-in infrastructure, and that might make, again, housing more attainable for a lot more people, because people worry about impact fees and whatnot, and all this kind of stuff you got to build to, form a new community. But if people had septic and their tiny home on it, that might be one way of solving that problem. So that might solve the sewer district issue.
I see. So on the topic of affordability and affordable housing, that's obviously a very important topic on many people's minds, because it's just, we really do need to be making 150 grand a year now to afford even just a median-sized house in Utah.
Yes.
I've been a strong proponent of loosening zoning laws, and is that pretty much what that Free to Build initiative is about?
I think that's part of their programming, and they're talking about ADUs, right, accessory dwelling units. But they're saying, here's kind of the toolkit. Take this to your local governments and say, hey, if you will loosen up zoning restrictions, here are the kind of communities we can bring in. But there's a lot of pushback, right? I mean, I was a government affairs director for the Utah Association of Realtors for several years, and I know the vested interest in trying to contract the market to prop up housing prices, right? Because, folks get paid on the commission, and the larger the purchase price, the larger the commission. And you've got, mortgage brokers and all those kind of folks. And there's just a lot of the economy that's built into that equity of homes. And if the housing market goes down, then a lot of that, equity goes away. So there are a lot of vested interest in keeping that housing market. And it's been so frustrating to watch the state of Utah appoint, I'm trying to think who the homeless czar is now. Former state senator starts
Wayne Niederhauser.
Yes.
Yep. He will not come on this show yet. Maybe he will.
Okay.
Actually,
come on, Wayne. Explain yourself. But putting this guy in charge of homelessness in Utah is like putting foxes in charge of the hen house, right?
Fist bump that.
And okay,
Man.
because what's happened?
Because it's just a position where you get to choose the winners and losers,
right?
And of course, his friends are very likely to be the winners, and
right,
and that's not a position an unelected leader should have.
No,
is that part of the libertarianism? Like that, all these unelected leaders shouldn't have quite so much power as they have here in Utah.
No, I don't. That might be libertarian neutral, but no. I mean, the fact that we put some czar in charge of housing in Utah doesn't sound very libertarian to me, and it's not going to solve the housing, and it hasn't solved the housing crisis.
We had the
Utah.
Housing czar on the program, Steve Waldrop.
Okay.
The homeless czar is Wayne Niederhauser.
Okay, all right.
But back to that. So, do you see a way that you could loosen the ADU laws so that somebody who has a home can just easily not hire an architect and to draw up the plans and see if the city council approves it or not? Is there a way that they could easily make ADUs happen?
I'd be looking at, supportive of legislation that maybe preempted a lot of local restrictions on that. I mean, and we do have, I know libertarians talk a lot about the city of Houston, which doesn't have a whole lot of zoning. And it's not perfect, but, housing does seem to be more affordable down there, and they seem to get by without a lot of the traditional zoning that many of us are used to. I don't know how much, number one, I could do as governor. Number two, what I could do given the existing legislature and who composes of it. I mean, you've got both, Senate President Stuart Adams and Speaker Mike Schultz, who are both developers, and they may want to do things in a way that, again, benefits their bottom line. But I think there's a critical mass. The Utah Foundation survey talked about housing being, the top issue that Utahns are concerned about. So I think if enough people get behind me, maybe we don't do it in the first 2 years, maybe we turn over the legislature with people who are more friendly to that, and we can move the needle on housing.
I love that idea, because ADUs, tiny homes, prefabricated homes. I think that, so a developer came on and said there used to be 30% of all housing used to be prefabricated homes, because that was way cheaper to get into for the working middle class. They just zoned it out of existence. It just doesn't happen anymore. And so we better pause. I think that's got to be all the way down, Audrey, or we're going to get that echo. Okay. So the point is that there are solutions. It's not like anybody brilliant has to come about and figure out the solution. There are solutions, but our state legislature is run by developers who are very interested in maintaining their profit margins on their development projects. How in the world do you ever get anything like that passed?
Well, and so another solution I'm big on is reforming our electoral system. So most of the world's democracies, small d democracies, have some form of what's called proportional representation. So you have multi-party democracies, not just a two-party duopoly. We get a two-party duopoly by single-choice elections, first past the post electoral system. Most of the world's democracies have moved on beyond that. I like to talk about Costa Rica. They used to have a Libertarian Party down there called Movimiento Libertario. And so the population would vote. 10% of the population voted Libertarian. They elected 10% of the seats to their National Assembly. So they didn't have a majority, but they had seats at the table, so they could contribute to the conversation. And so I want to see that happen. I think that's how we're talking about breaking up monopolies. That's how we break up political duopolies in Utah. Maybe we set, an example nationwide on that.
So whatever percentage of the population is of one political party will be the representation in the in the House.
So if we can get 15 to 20%, of Utahns voting Libertarian, we get 15 to 20% of the seats in our state legislature. And I talked about, maybe we start with multi-member districts. So I curate a blog, the Fair Vote Utah blog, talk about the Fair Vote Utah plan. So using kind of these concepts on how we might make it more inclusive of Utahns. And by the way, where proportional representation has been done around the world, you get more women elected to these assemblies. You get more historically underrepresented populations, communities represented to these populations. But obviously the powerful and the privileged don't want that, because they don't want to lose their power and privilege. So it'll take a little bit of heavy lifting. The good old boys, the powers that should not be, yes.
Yeah, they probably would not like that so much. Well, Rob, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great talking to you.
Great to visit with you.
Best of luck to you. How do people go and support your campaign?
Campaign website is freeutahns.org, and there's a donate button there, and contributions will just help us raise our profile, raise awareness, get our message out, and of course, go vote Libertarian if you can. The election, I think, is November 5th. Remember the 5th of November, and mail ballots, I think, go out October 15th.
And your name is on the ballot.
My name is on the ballot. Awesome. You do not need to write me in.
Yeah, that's great. All right, and I just want to tell you this program is sponsored by Utah Stories Magazine. This is Utah Stories. Go out to Utah Stories, subscribe to our free digital newsletter, or have this delivered right to your home for $3 a month. We are launching a brand new magazine called Faces of Utah. This is coming out at the beginning of November. If you want to read awesome entrepreneurial stories from some of the best, really cool entrepreneurs, there's a story on Kyle Whittingham too. Go out, become a member of Utah Stories. That's just $5 a month, and you will get this magazine, this book, delivered right to your home, absolutely free. And you'll help support this coverage and our ongoing investigations into the corruption in Utah. So with that, we're going to have your running mate on in just a couple minutes. And so stay tuned. We're going to take a little break, and we'll be right back. Cool.
Good stuff. Fun. Oh, you mentioned entrepreneurship. So that's one of the things on the website is there's this concept called underthrowing the government through subversive entrepreneurship.
Oh, really?
Yes.
What kinds of a subversive entrepreneurship? Welcome to Utah Stories. So today on the program, we are talking to the Libertarian governor candidate and also his running mate, Barry Short. Thank you so much for coming on, Barry.
Hey, thanks for having me, Richard. I appreciate the time.
Yeah. So when you look at the biggest problems we're faced with today here in Utah, with this growing divide between the rich and the poor, the middle class is getting squeezed out of the housing market. We're seeing grocery prices increase, energy prices increase. It's harder and harder to make ends meet. What would the libertarian solutions to these problems look like?
So much of this is going to be really difficult to deal with because not everything is limited to Utah. So much of this is coming from national policies. But one of the ways that I believe we can help with those national policies is to start setting some other policies at the state level and watch those trickle up. All we need to do is do things that succeed here, and we're going to be emulated. That's how everything like this works. That if you see something that's working, people want to adopt that. That's why we all. I can see your cell phone sitting here on the table. We've all adopted cell phones because they work better than a phone that you have to run and pick up across the room or across the house. It's convenient. So when something comes along that is successful, it gets adopted, and that's why we're talking about things like cutting back on some of our housing regulations to make it easier to build. One of the things that I learned recently is in the wake of the last big recession back in 2006, 2007, housing starts really dropped off nationwide. It dropped off by about 2/3. And in all the time since that, we've never regained the number of housing starts that we used to have. And as a result, we have a huge shortage of housing inventory. So we need to be doing things to get the inventory up. Everything is supply and demand, right? If you've got 5 people bidding on one house, it's going to sell for a whole lot more than if you've got 5 houses and one person bidding.
Yeah.
It's really that simple and basic.
And Governor Cox, he has an initiative to build 30,000 starter homes that could start at $350,000. Did I get that right? I think that's about right.
That's about right, yeah.
So is that solution contrary to libertarian values?
Well, we'd like to see it happen, but we'd like to see things happen more organically because, as you were talking about with Rob earlier, we get into issues of, are we just subsidizing the developers here as opposed to actually creating, affordable housing? I have a friend who's a social worker up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and she was dealing with a building, and she's trying to help people get into housing. That's one of the specific things she does. And she was meeting with this development group about a new building that they had, and there was going to be affordable housing available inside this multi-unit, big apartment complex sort of thing. And, but what they interpreted as being affordable housing was $4,000 a month.
Really? Wow.
And it was a studio apartment.
Oh, you're kidding.
And it was, and she got up and walked out.
Yeah,
she just said, "There's nothing more for me to talk about here." So we need to make sure if the government is doing anything like that, that it's not just feeding the beast that's already there. Is a $30,000 subsidy for this housing really just raising the price of the housing $30,000?
Or it's just probably taking from our existing tax base and taxpayers and giving it to the poorer taxpayers. So you're basically just doing a socialist solution.
You're right.
To a bigger problem.
We need to be doing something other than just shuffling money around. If that's all we're doing, that's not going to solve any problems. So we've got to come up with other ways of doing this. I should tell you a little bit about one of the things that the government is doing, though. I live in Cedar City, down in Iron County, home of Southern Utah University, and the state has been trying to move students down in that direction. Encourage them to go to SUU, to go to Utah Tech down in St. George, as opposed to here, because obviously in this area you have a lot of problems with student housing. There's already so many students here, and they thought one of the solutions to this was to try to get students to go out to the more dispersed facilities around the state, which sounds great, except that they didn't really do anything to provide for the growth in the student bodies in those areas. So what has happened in Cedar City is that we've taken the downtown core, which is where the university is located, and all of the older, smaller homes that should be starter homes are being gobbled up to be turned into student housing. They're knocking all of these, little 11, 1,200 square foot homes down, knocking them down, putting up big apartment complexes to hold the fact that in the past 10 years, the student body at SUU has more than doubled. Went from like a little under 4,000 to nearly 8,000 in that brief amount of time. So what the state has actually done is it's taken all of the starter housing out of play. It's not creating starter housing, it's destroying starter housing with these policies. So we need to think about the policies we're enacting. And we need to actually decide, yeah, this sounds good for this group, but are we causing problems for these other people by this? Are we even being consistent about what our goals are? And it seems to me that we've created all of these different pockets of activity, but in many cases, the different activities are contradictory to one another.
Yeah. I do coverage, and I go down to Moab every month during the summertime, and I see all these people living in vans. They're living the van life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can do that in your 20s, your early 20s. But as you get older, now I meet these van lifers who really want to find a piece of dirt that they could own. And
Yeah.
Moab's surrounded by federal land and all these empty spaces, open spaces, giant parcels that are owned by rich people, but they cannot find a place to just build anything on there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so obvious when you look at that problem what the possible solution could be. Maybe open up a little bit of federal land, loose zoning laws, parcel out little tiny lots, let people build what they want. But it's just there's just too many regulations in place for housing to allow anything like that. And so do you think that is the solution? Just really loosen regulations on housing and let people build what they want, put what they want on a piece of land?
I mean, we did that for the first, 150 years of this country. We had a huge amount of land, and most of it wasn't claimed, although maybe some of our native populations might argue about whether there was a claim on it or not. But the fact is that the population versus the amount of land available, it made it very easy for people to go out, find a piece of property, stake a claim to it, and do whatever they wanted to on it. We've reached the point, and we filled in everything from ocean to ocean, and it's all got a title on it somewhere. But as you mentioned, we do have this huge amount of federal land here in Utah. Some of it needs to be protected for the recreational opportunities and for its beauty and everything. But there's also a great deal of federal land in this state that it's just land.
Yeah,
it's nothing special.
70% of Utah.
70% of Utah. That's
Most
insane.
Of it is sagebrush.
I could probably take and cut that 70% in half, and I'd protect everything that pretty much everybody would want to have protected. And that'd free up a whole lot of land that we could go back and fill in. And there are other issues. Obviously, water is one of the issues that we are dealing with here. We're watching growth go nuts down in St. George, and they're having to deal with, well, how are we going to take showers? At some point, if you keep growing this population.
That again is a pretty obvious solution. You look at St. George, compare it to Henderson, Nevada.
Right.
They use 10 times less water per capita in Henderson, Nevada than they do St. George because they never had the water to begin with.
Right.
So you just mandate zero escape lawns, more than 20 gallons per day per person. You pay a premium, and I think that problem goes away pretty quickly. But here in Utah, we want abundance in every regard, and so we don't want to put those restrictions, I guess.
That's right.
You mentioned we were talking about inflation, and I'm interested in what you have to say about food costs. We've watched food costs in the U.S. really go way up since inflation, and most of our food cost is directly related to the cost of energy, fuel, because we ship most of our food in from Mexico and California. What would be your idea or the libertarian solution to increasing food costs, getting those costs back down, or maybe encouraging more locally grown food?
I think encouraging more locally grown food is probably a big part of our policy. We've had a lot of restrictions and regulations, once again, on what you can do with food if you grow it as locally, whether it's your home garden or even small scale farming and all. We've had a ton of that, and a lot of that can be repealed and taken away. I know not too far from here out in Copperton, for instance, they did away with business licensing in Copperton completely, and said if you're growing stuff in your garden and you want to put up a little stand out in front of your house and sell your excess produce, go for it. It's been a huge success out there that they allowed that sort of thing to happen. We had a bill that went through the legislature just a few years ago that had to do with buying a share of a cow and being able to take milk because there was a limitation that only the person who actually owned it outright could have the milk from that cow. You couldn't share it with someone else. Well, that's an example of the kind of regulation that can be knocked down. We've had similar things with beekeeping and the production of honey. But that also, when you talk about beekeeping, you're talking about making all of those fields really productive. You need those out there to fertilize all of those plants. So there's a lot of just, it's.
And it all comes back to liberty. Like I mentioned regulatory capture. That milk law you mentioned, I'm absolutely certain it's because the milk industry has regulatory capture and they don't want competitors.
That's exactly right.
And so it's like, why not go back to the freedom to have a cow, milk it, and share it with your neighbor or sell it if you want to?
Right. Share it. If you've got a place to keep your cow, you can own half of it. Your neighbor can own half of it. It produces, 8 gallons of milk. Fine. You each get 4 gallons of milk. Boom. We're done. The government doesn't even need to be involved in that, not at any level.
Yeah.
Unless you're, creating a nuisance for your neighbor or something. But there are other ways of adjudicating those disputes too.
Yeah, and one thing that I found interesting reading the same book, The Myth of Capitalism, is that I think it's a little bit people are a little bit confused about the founding fathers and what their vision was and why the Boston Tea Party happened. It wasn't just because there was a tax on the tea. It was that England monopolized the trade of tea, and they said, you got to buy our tea. Right. And it was to decentralize power. There was too many powers controlling people's way of living, and it was a revolt against those centralized powers that created the Constitution, and it's the reason why it was written the way it was. And so I think when you talk about libertarian values, you're actually talking about the values that establish this country in the way it was intended to be.
Absolutely, completely. My family, some of my earliest relatives arrived in 1625. They were refugees from France, and they'd spent a couple generations in England, but they were refugees during the wars of religion. They committed the capital crime in France of not being Catholic, and had to flee the country. And Huguenots, yes, Huguenots, and that tradition ultimately is our separation of church and state. That we said never again can the government dictate to us what we believe. It really is that kind of a fundamental thing that's really our heritage.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show,
all right.
Barry. And
Could I very briefly talk about elections?
oh yeah, sorry, we did want to touch on that.
I do
Definitely.
want to talk about
Go right ahead.
that only because obviously there's a lot of concern about our elections process in Utah. And so one of the things that I've been telling everybody is that I really hope to be Utah's last lieutenant governor. Because about 30 years ago, we did something in Utah that I probably would have backed at the time, which is that we abolished the position of Secretary of State and gave those duties to the lieutenant governor. The idea was that the lieutenant governor didn't really do much of anything, and we were paying them a lot of money. And so we said, well, let's just take these duties and give them to the lieutenant governor. And it would have worked except for one thing that's a problem there, and that is that we don't elect our lieutenant governor separately from the governor. They're elected on a ticket. And so we're not ending up with a person in charge of our elections office who is elected to do that job. They're being chosen because, they balance the ticket, or, well, I've got a governor who's from the city, so I need a lieutenant governor from a rural part of the state, or vice versa, or I've got a man, I need a woman, whatever. So we're not really having a person in charge of elections who has been elected specifically for that duty.
And that was formerly a Secretary of State.
Secretary of State
I
is
did not
what
know
does that in almost every other state.
Okay.
That the idea that the elections office is run by effectively
So
an
that's
appointed person, as you were talking about earlier with the problem with appointed bureaucrats. The lieutenant governor is essentially an appointed bureaucrat, handpicked by the governor.
So Utah is unique in that respect?
There may be one or two other states, but it's really rare. Almost every other state has a Secretary of State, and the elections office is one of their key duties. Sometimes they're also involved in some contractual things and patents and stuff like that, but because it's record keeping.
You also mentioned you don't like that we have all this mail-in balloting here in Utah.
The mail-in ballots are very convenient, and I understand why people like that. And it probably makes a fair amount of sense in some of the very rural areas of the state. And I wouldn't take away the ability to get your ballot by mail, but I think it should be opt-in. One of the things that people don't always realize is how mobile Utah's population is. We move around within the state, we move in and out of the state a lot. And in this election, the ballots are about to go out in about 2-3 weeks now, around the 15th of October. There will be somewhere around 150 to 200,000 ballots that will go to an address that is no longer where that voter is at. So we've got all of these ballots out there, and we don't really know what happens to them. Some of them will end up sitting in mailboxes. Many of them will be returned by the post office to the county clerks. And our clerks do a great job of cleansing the voter rolls after every election. Mm-hmm. But there are all of these potential ballots out there
that could be harvested,
that could be harvested, that could be cast improperly. And the instructions from the state to the county clerks has always been, try to count the ballots. If you get a ballot and it's questionable, you should probably accept it. That's the general gist.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is roll that back, say, if you want to opt in and get your ballot by mail, that's fine. We've done absentee ballots for, 50, 100 years. That's not a big change. But I want to do that. I want to get back to having polling places open. I really think those are important.
Yeah.
And not in the way that a lot of people think of it, but it's community involvement. When you go and cast your ballot, you see people there. You probably know, or at least know of, the people who are working at that polling place. And as a result, we end up trusting what's going on much more because we're hands-on. We're involved in it in a way that we aren't with the mail-in ballots. Mm-hmm. With the mail-in ballots, it's off in the distance. There was a poll that KUTV did 2 or 3 weeks ago asking how much confidence people had in the Utah election system. And it was like close to 75% of people either said, I have no confidence, or I have some pretty serious questions about the validity of our elections. We've done crazy things. We had a race, a Republican primary down in Washington County 2 years ago that was decided by, I believe, 8 or 9 votes. By state law, that would trigger a recount. But they didn't do a full recount. They grabbed a stack of ballots, ran them through the counting machine, took them out, ran them through the counting machine again, and said, well, see, it got the same result both times, so we consider this to be valid. Well, that's not a valid recount.
No.
So we've got to fix that up. But anyway, going back to what I want is what I would hope to do is that 2 years from now, we would have a good constitutional amendment on the ballot, which would abolish the position of lieutenant governor and reinstate the position of secretary of state, who would be elected by the people and would be responsible to the people for his or her actions.
Sounds like it would make sense to me. All right. Well, thanks so much, Barry.
All
Appreciate
right.
you
Thank
coming
you,
on.
Richard. Appreciate it.
Yeah, good luck to you.
Thank
So
you.
if people want to be more involved in your campaign, say that web address again.
Yes, it's freeutahns, UTAHNS.org. And
freeutahns.org.
Freeutahns.
Oh, free.
Free.
All
Let
right.
us all be
Yeah,
free.
let us be
Live free, America.
Not free. All right. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to support this content and coverage, go out, become a member of Utah Stories. That's at utahstories.com. And we have a very special magazine we're launching, Faces of Utah. It's some of the best entrepreneurs in Utah who started incredible businesses. We're telling their stories in this wonderful book, and it can be delivered to your home right before Thanksgiving. And you will also be supporting our local coverage and our efforts to decentralize our economies and buy local for the holidays. You'll get a lot of great ideas for how to do that in this book. And go out to visit utahstories.com. And with your membership of $5 a month, you get that magazine. Subscribe, like, follow us on Instagram. I think that's about it. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.